the mountain range stretched endlessly across the hostile terrain, its jagged peaks cutting through the gray morning sky like broken teeth. Sarah Mitchell pressed her back against the cold rock face, her breath forming small clouds in the freezing air. She had been a Navy sniper for 6 years, but nothing in her training had prepared her for what was unfolding in the valley below. 220 American SEALs were pinned down in what should have been a routine extraction mission. The intelligence had been wrong, catastrophically wrong. What was supposed to be a small enemy outpost had turned into a death trap, with hostile forces surrounding the valley on 3 sides. Sarah watched through her scope as explosions rocked the valley floor, sending plumes of black smoke into the air. She was part of a small reconnaissance team positioned on the eastern ridge, nearly 2 miles from the main force. Her spotter, Marcus Chen, lay beside her with the rangefinder. He had been calling out distances and wind speeds for the past hour, his voice steady despite the chaos below. They both knew that their team of 12 was too small to make a difference in a firefight of this magnitude. The radio crackled with desperate voices. Commander Blake's transmission cut through the static, his words clipped and urgent. The main force was running low on ammunition. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted. 3 helicopters had already been shot down trying to reach them. The enemy had positioned anti-aircraft weapons in the surrounding hills, creating a deadly umbrella that nothing could penetrate. Sarah adjusted her position slightly, feeling the weight of her rifle against her shoulder. It was a custom-built weapon, one she had modified herself over years of service. She knew every scratch on its surface, every slight quirk in its mechanism. It had never failed her, but she had also never been asked to do the impossible. Marcus lowered his rangefinder and turned to her, his face grim. The enemy commander had been spotted. He was directing the assault from a fortified position on the opposite ridge, surrounded by guards and protected by concrete barriers. The distance was beyond extreme, nearly 3,000 yards. In sniper terms, it was almost fantasy. Sarah had made long shots before. Her record was 2,400 yards, a shot that had earned her commendations and respect from her peers. But this was different. The wind was unpredictable, swirling through the mountain passes in complex patterns. The target was partially concealed, and the angle was severe, requiring calculations that pushed the limits of ballistics. Her team leader, Captain Rodriguez, crawled over to their position. His uniform was torn, and dried blood stained his sleeve from a grazing wound. He looked at Sarah with eyes that held both hope and resignation. If they could take out the enemy commander, it might create enough confusion for the trapped SEALs to break through the encirclement. It was a desperate plan, a last-chance gamble. But Rodriguez was also realistic. He told Sarah that no one would blame her if she said it was impossible. The shot was beyond what anyone could reasonably expect. The wind alone made it nearly suicidal to attempt. Even the best snipers in the world would hesitate. He gave her the choice, making it clear that this was her decision alone. Sarah looked back through her scope at the valley below. She could see the American positions being slowly compressed, the defensive perimeter shrinking under relentless pressure. Medics were working frantically on the wounded. Young men, barely out of their teens, were fighting for their lives. 220 souls, depending on a miracle. She thought about her training at Fort Benning, where her instructors had pushed her beyond what she thought possible. She remembered the doubt in their eyes when she first arrived. A woman in a field dominated by men. She had proven herself shot by shot, earning her place through skill and determination. Her father, a Marine veteran, had taught her to shoot when she was 8 years old. He always said that a rifle was just a tool, but the person behind it made all the difference. Marcus began running calculations, factoring in air pressure, temperature, and the complex wind patterns. He used a handheld computer and years of experience, but even he looked uncertain. The numbers were brutal. The bullet would drop over 800 inches over that distance. The wind drift could push it off target by several feet, and they would have one shot, maybe two, before the enemy located their position and returned fire. Sarah's hands moved automatically, making minute adjustments to her scope. She had developed an almost intuitive feel for her weapon, an understanding that went beyond mathematics. She could sense when conditions were right, when all the variables aligned in that brief window of possibility. But that sense was telling her that this shot was on the edge of impossible. The radio chatter grew more desperate. Another position had been overrun. Casualties were mounting. Commander Blake's voice came through again, this time tinged with something Sarah rarely heard from seasoned officers. Fear. Not for himself, but for his men. They were running out of time. Captain Rodriguez received orders from higher command. Air support was still 30 minutes away, but intelligence suggested the enemy was preparing for a final assault. Once that began, the American position would collapse within minutes. The window for Sarah's shot was closing rapidly. She settled into her shooting position, feeling the familiar pressure points where the rifle met her body. Her breathing slowed, becoming rhythmic and controlled. Years of training took over, pushing aside doubt and fear. She had learned to enter a state of absolute focus, where the world narrowed to just her, the weapon, and the target. Through her scope, she studied the enemy commander. He was in his 50s, with a gray beard and a distinctive red scarf. He moved with confidence, pointing and giving orders to his men. He believed he was untouchable, safe behind his concrete barriers and protected by distance. Sarah watched his patterns, noting how he gestured when he paused, creating a mental map of his movements. Marcus whispered the wind call, his voice barely audible. The conditions were terrible, but not impossible. A brief lull in the gusts created a narrow opportunity. Sarah felt her heartbeat slow, each pulse measured and steady. Her finger rested lightly on the trigger, not applying pressure yet, just maintaining contact. She thought about all the people depending on this moment. The SEALs trapped below had families waiting for them, children who wanted their fathers to come home, wives and husbands counting the days until reunion. Each of those 220 lives represented a web of connections, of love and hope. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her shoulders. But Sarah had learned long ago that pressure was something to acknowledge and then set aside. Doubt was poison to a sniper. Second-guessing destroyed focus. She needed to trust her training, trust her instincts, and trust the weapon in her hands. Everything else was just noise. The enemy commander moved, stepping slightly out from behind his barrier to get a better view of the battle. It was a small movement, creating only a slightly larger window of opportunity. Marcus hissed urgently, calling out the opening. Sarah's finger moved to the trigger, applying the first pressure. Time seemed to slow. She could hear her own heartbeat, feel the slight tension in the trigger mechanism. The crosshairs settled on the target, steady despite the impossible distance. Every variable aligned in her mind. Elevation, windage, the slight cant of the rifle, the rotation of the earth itself. This was the moment that would define her career, her life, and potentially save or doom 220 brothers in arms. The weight of that single bullet felt like the weight of the world. Sarah exhaled slowly, her finger tightening on the trigger, and everything hung in the balance. The rifle kicked against Sarah's shoulder with familiar force, the sound echoing off the surrounding peaks. For a moment that stretched into eternity, nothing happened. The bullet traveled through space at over 2,000 feet per second, but across that enormous distance, even that incredible speed seemed slow. Sarah kept her eye pressed to the scope, watching. Marcus beside her held his breath, the rangefinder forgotten in his hands. The other members of their reconnaissance team had gathered behind them, drawn by the knowledge that something significant was happening. Nobody spoke. The only sound was the distant rumble of explosions and gunfire from the valley below. 3 seconds passed. 4. The bullet arced through the complex mountain air, fighting wind and gravity, its trajectory influenced by forces that Sarah had calculated but could never fully control. 5 seconds. 6. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest, though her hands remained perfectly steady on the rifle. Then, through the scope's magnified view, she saw the enemy commander's head snap back. His body crumpled, falling behind the concrete barrier. For a heartbeat, his soldiers didn't react, confused by what had happened. Their leader had simply dropped, with no apparent cause. No gunshot had been heard across that distance. It seemed like he had simply collapsed. Marcus grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip tight with excitement and disbelief. Captain Rodriguez was already on the radio, confirming the hit to command. The reconnaissance team erupted in subdued celebration. Aware that they were still in hostile territory but unable to contain their reaction to what they had just witnessed, Sarah allowed herself a moment to process what she had done. The shot that everyone said was impossible, the shot that veteran snipers would have refused to take. She had made it. But there was no time to celebrate. The battle was still raging, and the trapped SEALs were still in desperate danger. In the enemy position, chaos erupted. Through her scope, Sarah watched as soldiers ran to their fallen commander, shouting and pointing in confusion. They didn't know where the shot had come from. Some looked toward the valley, thinking perhaps a lucky round from the American forces had found its mark. Others scanned the surrounding ridges, but their eyes passed over Sarah's position without recognition. The enemy's coordinated assault began to falter. Without their commander's directions, the various units lost synchronization. Some continued their advance, while others hesitated, waiting for orders that would never come. The tight encirclement that had been slowly crushing the American forces began to show gaps. Commander Blake's voice came over the radio, urgent but controlled. He had noticed the change in enemy behavior. His tactical mind quickly assessed the opportunity. He ordered his forces to concentrate on the weakest point in the enemy line, the section where confusion was greatest. The trapped SEALs, despite their exhaustion and depleted ammunition, responded with the discipline of elite warriors. Sarah watched the breakthrough begin. American forces, which had been pinned down and defensive, suddenly surged forward in a coordinated push. They exploited the confusion, hitting the enemy line where it was most disorganized. Explosions marked the use of their remaining grenades and rockets, conserved for this critical moment. But the enemy forces were numerous and well-equipped. Even without their commander, they began to recover from the initial shock. Secondary officers took control, rallying their men. The breakthrough was happening, but it was coming at a terrible cost. Sarah could see through her scope that American casualties were mounting. Captain Rodriguez issued new orders to the reconnaissance team. They needed to provide covering fire to help keep the enemy confused and disorganized. Sarah shifted her focus, looking for high-value targets. Officers trying to restore order, machine gun positions that threatened the breakthrough, anti-aircraft crews that might still shoot down rescue helicopters. She fired again, and an enemy officer directing reinforcements fell. Marcus called out new targets, his voice rapid but clear. Sarah worked her rifle with mechanical efficiency, each shot carefully placed, each one contributing to the chaos in enemy ranks. Her team members joined in with their own weapons, adding to the volume of fire that swept the enemy positions. The battle became a race against time. Could the SEALs break through before enemy reinforcements arrived? Intelligence reported that hostile forces from nearby positions were moving toward the fight, drawn by the sound of heavy combat. If they arrived before the Americans escaped the valley, the situation would become even worse. Sarah's rifle grew hot from sustained firing. She had already gone through 2 magazines, an unusually high rate of fire for a precision sniper. But this was no longer about careful, measured shots. This was about maintaining pressure, keeping the enemy off balance, buying time for her brothers in arms to reach safety. Through her scope, she saw the American forces making progress. They had opened a corridor through the enemy line, a narrow path marked by fire and violence. The wounded were being carried or dragged by their comrades, no one left behind. Medics worked as they moved, trying to stabilize the most critically injured while under fire. Then, Sarah spotted a new threat. An enemy technical, a pickup truck mounted with a heavy machine gun, was racing toward the breakthrough point. If it reached an effective firing position, it could tear through the escaping Americans, potentially closing the corridor they had fought so hard to open. The vehicle bounced over rough terrain, its gunner struggling to maintain his balance. Marcus saw it too. He called out the range, 1,800 yards and closing fast. It was a difficult shot, made worse by the vehicle's movement. Sarah would need to lead the target, accounting for the truck's speed and direction, while also factoring in the ballistics of her weapon. She had seconds to make the calculation and take the shot. She exhaled slowly, tracking the vehicle through her scope. Her mind processed the variables automatically, drawing on years of experience. The truck hit a rough patch of ground, bouncing violently. The driver fought for control, Sarah saw her opportunity in that moment of instability. She fired. The bullets struck the driver through the windshield. The technical veered sharply, rolling as it left the rough path and tumbled down a small embankment. The machine gunner was thrown clear, the weapon lost in the crash. Another threat neutralized. Another few moments bought for the escaping forces. The radio crackled with updates. The forward elements of the SEAL force had reached the edge of the valley, moving into terrain that offered better cover. Commander Blake's voice carried a note of cautious optimism. They were going to make it. Not all of them. The casualty reports were already devastating, but most would survive. Sarah continued to scan for threats, her finger never far from the trigger. The enemy was still trying to close the corridor, to trap the remaining Americans in the valley. But their efforts were increasingly disorganized. The loss of their commander had created a vacuum of leadership that their secondary officers couldn't fully fill. High above, Sarah heard a sound that made her heart leap, the distinctive roar of attack helicopters. Air support had finally arrived. A pair of Apache gunships swept into the valley, their cannons and missiles immediately engaging enemy positions. The anti-aircraft guns that had been protecting the enemy tried to track them, but the helicopters were fast and well flown. Behind the Apaches came transport helicopters, Chinooks flying low and fast. They swooped into the areas where the Americans had established temporary security, their rear ramps already lowered. SEALs poured into the aircraft, dragging their wounded with them. The helicopter crews provided suppressing fire from their door guns, adding to the overwhelming firepower that now protected the extraction. Captain Rodriguez ordered the reconnaissance team to prepare for their own extraction. A helicopter would pick them up from a clearing half a mile from their current position. They needed to move quickly before enemy forces could redirect their attention to the ridge. Sarah took one last look through her scope at the battlefield below. The valley was scarred with craters and burning vehicles. Bodies lay scattered across the ground, both enemy and friendly. The cost of this engagement would be measured in lives lost and families shattered. But because of her shot, because of one impossible bullet, 220 SEALs were not all dead in that valley. She carefully secured her rifle and stood, her legs stiff from hours in shooting position. Marcus grinned at her, shaking his head in amazement. The other team members looked at her with a mixture of awe and respect. They had all witnessed something extraordinary, a shot that would become legend in sniper circles. The team moved quickly through the mountain terrain, following Captain Rodriguez toward the extraction point. Behind them, the sounds of battle began to fade as the American forces successfully withdrew. The enemy, bloodied and leaderless, did not pursue with any real coordination. As they ran, Sarah felt the weight of exhaustion settling over her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the battle was fading, leaving behind the bone-deep tiredness that always followed combat. Her shoulder ached from the rifle's recoil. Her hands trembled slightly, a delayed reaction to the stress and pressure. They reached the clearing just as the helicopter appeared over the ridge, flying fast and low. It touched down only long enough for the team to board, then immediately lifted off, banking away from potential ground fire. Sarah strapped into her seat and closed her eyes for a moment, letting the vibration of the aircraft wash over her. Through the open door, she could see the valley receding behind them. Smoke still rose from multiple points, marking the battlefield they were leaving behind. Other helicopters were visible, ferrying the rescued SEALs to safety. The mission had been saved from total disaster, though the price paid was still terrible. Commander Blake's voice came over the radio net, addressing all forces. He spoke of courage and sacrifice, of the men who had not made it out. His voice was thick with emotion as he thanked everyone who had contributed to the survival of his unit. He specifically mentioned the sniper team, the impossible shot that had changed everything. Sarah opened her eyes and looked at her hands. They were steady now, the trembling stopped. These hands had just accomplished something that most people would consider impossible. She had taken a shot that no one else dared attempt, across a distance that defied conventional wisdom, in conditions that should have made success impossible. But she had made it. The bullet had flown true, and because of that, hundreds of families would see their loved ones again. Hundreds of warriors would live to fight another day. One shot, one moment, one decision. The helicopter touched down at the forward operating base just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Sarah stepped off the aircraft, her legs unsteady after the flight. The base was chaos, with medical teams rushing to treat the wounded, officers shouting orders, and vehicles moving equipment and personnel. The full scale of the day's events was evident in every corner. She made her way to the debriefing area, following Captain Rodriguez through the organized confusion. Other members of the reconnaissance team walked beside her, all of them silent, processing what they had witnessed and participated in. The weight of combat always took time to settle, to transform from immediate experience into memory. The debriefing room was packed. Commander Blake was already there, despite having just been extracted from the valley. His uniform was torn and stained, and his face showed the exhaustion of a man who had been fighting for his life hours earlier. When Sarah entered, he stood, as did every other SEAL in the room. It took her a moment to realize they were standing for her. Blake crossed the room and extended his hand. His grip was firm, and his eyes held an intensity that made Sarah understand the depth of his gratitude. He told her plainly that she had saved his men. Without that shot, without the confusion and chaos it created, they would all be dead in that valley. 220 lives, preserved by one bullet. The debriefing itself was technical and detailed. Intelligence officers wanted to know everything: the exact conditions, the calculations used, the equipment specifications, the target's behavior before the shot. Sarah answered their questions methodically, walking them through her thought process and decision-making. Marcus corroborated her account, adding his perspective as her spotter. The senior officers present seemed almost unable to believe what had happened. A 3,000-yard shot, in mountain winds, at a steep angle, under combat stress. One of them, a colonel with 30 years of experience, said quietly that he had never heard of a confirmed kill at that distance under those conditions. It was, by any measure, extraordinary. But as the technical questions continued, Sarah found her mind drifting. She thought about the enemy commander she had killed. He had been a person too, with his own story, his own reasons for being in that valley. War reduced people to targets, to problems to be solved, but Sarah had never lost sight of the human cost on both sides. Taking a life, even in combat, even when necessary, was never something to celebrate lightly. After the debriefing, she was told that press officers wanted to interview her. The story of the impossible shot was already spreading through military channels. Sarah declined. She had never sought publicity, never wanted to be the face of anything. She was a professional doing her job, nothing more. The officers respected her wishes, though they warned her that the story would likely get out regardless. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in her bunk, staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying the day's events in an endless loop. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the view through her scope. The enemy commander, the crosshairs settling, the moment of the trigger pull. The shot would follow her for the rest of her life. She knew. It would become the defining moment of her military career. The next morning brought news of the casualties from the battle. 18 SEALs had been killed in action. Another 32 were wounded, some critically. Sarah attended the memorial service held at the base, standing at the back as names were read and boots, rifles, and helmets were displayed in tribute to the fallen. Each name represented a life ended, a family's loss, a story cut short. Commander Blake spoke at the service, his voice breaking at times as he honored his fallen men. He spoke of their courage, their dedication, their sacrifice. He also spoke of how many more would have died if not for the actions of brave individuals who took risks to save others. He didn't mention Sarah by name, but many eyes turned toward her during that part of his speech. After the service, families of some of the rescued SEALs approached Sarah. A wife with 2 young children thanked her for bringing her husband home. A mother, her eyes red from crying, hugged Sarah and whispered her gratitude. These moments were harder than the battle itself. Sarah had never wanted this kind of attention, this weight of other people's gratitude. But she also understood that what she had done mattered. The shot had saved lives. That was not something to dismiss or minimize. It was the reason she had joined the military, the reason she had pushed herself to become the best sniper she could be, to make a difference, to protect those who needed protecting. In the days that followed, the story of the shot spread beyond the immediate military circles. News organizations picked up on it, though without Sarah's name or specific details due to operational security. The narrative became simplified. A heroic sniper making an impossible shot to save trapped soldiers. The complexity, the calculations, the doubt and fear, all of it was stripped away to create a simple tale of heroism. Sarah found herself pulled from active deployment and sent back to the United States for what officers termed operational rest and assessment. She suspected it was more about managing the attention her shot had generated. The military wanted time to decide how to handle the story, whether to publicize it or keep it quiet. Back at Fort Benning, Sarah returned to her instructor duties. She taught new sniper candidates the fundamentals of marksmanship, the mathematics of ballistics, the psychology of long-range shooting. She never mentioned her own shot, but her students knew. Word had spread through the sniper community, and Sarah Mitchell had become something of a legend. One of her students, a young corporal named Davis, asked her after class about making difficult shots under pressure. Sarah considered the question carefully before answering. She told him that the technical skills were important, that understanding ballistics and wind and all the variables was crucial. But equally important was the mental preparation, the ability to make a decision and commit to it fully. She explained that doubt destroyed a sniper. Second-guessing, hesitation, fear of failure, all of these things would cause a miss. When the moment came, when all the calculations were done and the target was in the crosshairs, a sniper had to trust themselves completely. Had to believe that the shot was possible, even when everyone else said it wasn't. Davis asked if she ever had doubts. Sarah smiled slightly and told him the truth. Every single time. Doubt was natural. It was human. The trick was not to let it control your actions. To acknowledge it, set it aside, and focus on the task at hand. Confidence wasn't the absence of doubt. It was the ability to act effectively despite doubt. Months passed. Sarah continued teaching, occasionally going on training deployments, but no longer sent to active combat zones. She suspected this was partly due to the attention her shot had generated, and partly because senior officers felt she had already proven everything she needed to prove. Her place in sniper history was secure. She received official recognition for her actions. A commendation was added to her record, though the specific details remained classified. Commander Blake personally wrote a letter of appreciation that went into her permanent file. But the recognition that mattered most to Sarah came from her fellow snipers, the quiet respect and acknowledgement from people who understood exactly what she had accomplished. One afternoon, Sarah received a call from Marcus Chen. He had been promoted and was now running his own training program. They talked for over an hour, reminiscing about that day in the mountains, discussing how it had changed both of their careers. Marcus told her that he still thought about it regularly, still couldn't quite believe they had pulled it off. Sarah admitted that she felt the same way. In her rational mind, she could review all the factors, all the calculations, and understand how the shot had been possible. But emotionally, it still felt like something beyond explanation. A moment where skill, preparation, and luck had aligned perfectly. A moment where the impossible had become real. As they talked, Marcus mentioned that several of the SEALs she had helped save had reached out to him, wanting to connect with Sarah to express their thanks. She asked him not to pass along her contact information. Not because she didn't appreciate their gratitude, but because she didn't want to become defined solely by that one moment. She was more than that single shot, more than one day in the mountains. The war continued, as wars do. Other battles were fought, other heroes emerged, other stories were told. The situation in that particular region evolved and changed, shaped by events far beyond any single engagement. But for the 220 SEALs who had been trapped in that valley, and for their families, that day remained forever significant. Sarah eventually left active duty, transitioning to reserve status and then to civilian life. She took a position as a law enforcement sniper with a major city police department, using her skills in a different context. The work was less dramatic than military operations, but no less important. She provided overwatch for high-risk operations, protected civilians during crisis situations, and trained other officers in precision shooting. She rarely spoke about her military service, and almost never about that specific shot. When pressed by curious colleagues, she would deflect, saying that she had done her job like thousands of other service members. But occasionally, late at night, she would take out her old rifle, now retired from service, and run her hands along its familiar contours. The weapon was a piece of her history, a tool that had performed flawlessly when everything depended on it. Sarah had kept it as a reminder, not of glory or heroism, but of responsibility, of the weight that came with having skills others didn't possess, of the obligation to use those skills when lives hung in the balance. Years after the battle, Sarah attended a veterans reunion event. She hadn't planned to go, but a friend convinced her. In the crowd, she spotted Commander Blake, now retired and working in the private sector. Their eyes met across the room, and he made his way over to her. They talked for a while, updating each other on their lives. Blake had grandchildren now, a detail that made Sarah smile. He had made it home to see them grow up, as had most of his men. He thanked her again, though more quietly than in the debriefing room years ago. He said that not a day went by when he didn't think about what she had done. Sarah told him that she hoped he could move past it, that dwelling on that day wasn't healthy for either of them. Blake nodded but said something that stayed with Sarah, that some moments defined lives, not because they were the only important moments, but because they represented everything that came before and influenced everything that came after. That shot was the culmination of all her training, all her choices, all the discipline and skill she had developed. It deserved to be remembered. Later that evening, Sarah stood outside the venue, looking up at the stars. She thought about the girl she had been, learning to shoot with her father in rural fields. The young recruit, fighting to prove herself in a demanding environment. The student, mastering the complex mathematics of long-range shooting. Every step had led to that moment on the mountain ridge. She thought about all the shots she had taken in her career, the routine ones and the difficult ones, about the lives saved and the enemies neutralized, about the weight of being a warrior, of having the power to end life, and the responsibility to use that power wisely. It was a burden she had carried without complaint, understanding it as the price of expertise. The shot would always be with her. In quiet moments, she would see it again. The view through the scope, the enemy commander in the crosshairs, the gentle pressure on the trigger. 3,000 yards. Impossible conditions. One chance. She had taken it, and 220 people had lived because of that decision. Sarah had never wanted to be a hero. She had wanted to be excellent at her profession, to make a difference, to serve something larger than herself. The shot had made her famous within certain circles, but fame had never been the goal. The goal had been simple, to do the job, no matter how difficult, no matter the pressure. As she drove home that night, Sarah reflected on the strange journey her life had taken, from small-town girl to one of the most accomplished snipers in military history, from obscurity to legend. But through it all, she remained the same person, disciplined, focused, committed to excellence. The shot hadn't changed who she was, it had simply revealed it. The rifle was locked away at home now, a relic of another life. But the lessons it had taught her remained active: patience, precision, the importance of preparation, the courage to act when others hesitated. These weren't just lessons for combat, they were lessons for life itself. Sarah Mitchell had taken a shot that everyone feared, that most believed impossible. She had looked at the odds, assessed the risk, and decided to try anyway. Not for glory or recognition, but because 220 lives depended on it. That decision, and the skill to execute it, would forever mark her as extraordinary. But in her own mind, Sarah remained simply a professional who had done her job. The shot was remarkable, yes, but it was also the logical extension of years of training and preparation. When the moment came, she had been ready. That, more than the distance or the difficulty, was what mattered most. The story would be told and retold, growing in the telling as stories do. But the truth was simpler than any legend. A sniper, a rifle, a target, and the courage to take the shot when everything depended on it. That moment in the mountains would echo through time, a reminder that sometimes, the impossible was just another challenge to overcome.